Hello and welcome to our Lakeside chat. We are David Wofford and Katie Noonan, co-chairs of the Rotary Nature Center Friends. And we're so happy that you can join us tonight.
As we begin our program, it is important for us to acknowledge that we are on stolen land, that Lake Merritt is part of Ohlone territory. We hear now from Corinna Gould, spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of Lashon and co-founder of Segura Te Land Trust.
Good afternoon, relatives. My name is Corinna Gould. I am the spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of Lashon. We are here today at what most folks think of as Lake Merritt. We are in the territory of Huichin. Huichin is actually a territory that encompasses 6 Bay Area cities: Oakland, Berkeley, Alameda, Emeryville, Albany, and Piedmont. And so this is a place that my ancestors have been since the beginning of time. And this was a place of abundance. I'm so happy that people from all walks of life that now come into our territory can enjoy this beautiful place that my ancestors have enjoyed since the beginning of time. My relationship to the land that I have been born to, raising my children and grandchildren here, has been to tell the story, the truth of what happened on this land before other people came here. I'm hoping that as we begin to learn these lessons of fires in California, the pandemic that's happening, that human beings come back to living in reciprocity with the earth.
Thank you so much for being here this evening. I truly appreciate it.
Well, it's great to be here, and I'm even wearing the t-shirt.
You are.
Can't do a lecture on Lake Merritt without that t-shirt. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. I've been working on a book about Lake Merritt, and I've been working on estuaries and their biology for decades. And I want to start by saying a few words about that. So this is the book that I've been doing, and I'm going to take a few things from this book tonight for this lecture. This book is submitted, but not ready for printing. It'll be a few months from now. So I've worked around the Pacific Ocean in particular, but other places as well. And the yellow dots on this show places that I've done research or at least visited seriously on reefs, mostly by scuba. And the green dots are estuaries, and in particular along the coast of Baja California and California all the way up to Washington and Alaska. We did a little project there. So what I'd like to do tonight is to show you a little bit about these kinds of things, and then get deeper into Lake Merritt and what it's all about in terms of an estuary and so forth. So we have a definition problem in a certain sense, in that these various 4 words here, lake, slough, estuary, and lagoon, all have technical meanings, but sometimes in general senses we get confused and use, or not confused necessarily, but we talk about it in a different way. So a lake is an inland body. I don't think anybody's particularly confused by that, either freshwater or salt water, like the Salton Sea, incidentally, which has a lot of foraminifera living in it. And I will explain those in a moment. And then there's a slough, which is really a muddy and marshy tidal creek or area, usually back from the ocean. And that's what Lake Merritt used to be. We'll see that later on. And then there's estuaries, and this is the zone of mixing between seawater and freshwater at the mouth of a river, and usually it's perpendicular to the coast. In contrast to a lagoon, which is a shallow stretch of seawater enclosed by a reef barrier island or sandbars, but it's parallel to the coast. And I think of all of these definitions, Lake Merritt fits that of lake and an estuary, or an estuarine lake. Now, This shows sea level for the past 780,000 years along the bottom, and to the right is the modern day period. And you'll notice that sea level has been below the level of San Francisco Bay for most of this period of time. And there's only a few times when sea level rose to a height that would allow the ocean to invade San Francisco Bay. These are called the Milankovitch cycles. They're related to the gravity in the solar system, particularly Jupiter and Saturn, and how they displace the shape of the orbit of the Earth and a few other things. And so we get this pattern, and you can see, as I said, that mostly it's below the depth of San Francisco Bay. So San Francisco Bay was all land, except for two times in that last 780,000 years. One is here. Can you see the pointer? Or does it show up? Anybody know?
Yeah.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so here's the 125,000 to about 120,000 year high peak, an interglacial period when it was warmer and sea level was about 27 feet, 8 meters or so higher than sea level is today. And then the next time, well, sea level fell all the way down to 120 meters, almost 400 feet below the level of the ocean today. And that held true until about 18,000 years ago. And then sea level began to rise. And it rose up very slowly, well, quite rapidly geologically, and then reached the bay about 8,000 years ago. We'll see more of that in a minute. And finally, sea level rose to about where it is today, 4,000 years ago. So we're talking about a San Francisco Bay and the Lake Merritt estuary are young features geologically, only 4,000 years old or so. And this is a worldwide phenomenon. So I want to show a few things. Here's, for example, a marine terrace at Goat Rock Beach, north of. Okay, so this is a rocky terrace at Goat Rock Beach, north of Bodega Bay, which you can see in the back. There's Bodega Head, and this was eroded at that higher stand of sea level. There's also been a little bit of rise geologically, tectonically along this coast, so it's a bit higher than 27 feet. And you can see there are old sea stacks here. There's alluvium that has been deposited on top of the ocean cut platform. And on occasion along these cliffs and down in Bodega Head, we find fossils that we can date. And they tell us that the ocean was much warmer than it is now. So we also have evidence from San Francisco Bay itself, and this is an illustration from a paper we did with a student, Amy Leeson, and she and I worked on this. And so this shows the depth of water up at the top, the white part. That's the water in San Francisco Bay today. The dashed area down here is the last, or is the modern day sediment. So that would have accumulated sometime in the last 10,000 years or so. And then the dotted pattern in here is sand dunes or sandy deposits. And we see this right next to Lake Merritt, and it's called the Merritt sand. And it's all wind-blown by the time it gets to Oakland. And Oakland itself is built on top of this Merritt sand, which is exposed along the western, occasionally, along the western side of Lake Merritt. And then below that is this alluvial material showing that San Francisco Bay was dry at the time. So there's alluvium being delivered to the bay from all the streams. And then we come into the Yerba Buena mud, which is the mud that was deposited during the 125,000 high stand of sea level. And it varies in its thickness. It also varies in its foraminiferal content and other fossils. And then lastly, we have alluvium at the bottom of that from the prior time when sea level was much lower and the bay was not a bay, but dry land. Here's some of the forams from that sequence, the Yerba Buena mud, and these are all 125,000 years old. They're also all alive today. In fact, the foraminiferal assemblage from 125,000 years ago is identical to the modern day foram assemblage in the bay, with one exception, and that's an introduced species that was introduced in 1982 into San Francisco Bay. It was distributed originally, or discovered, I should say, near the East Bay, and that has since spread throughout most of the bay. And it looks something like this one down at the bottom, Trochamina hadai. We know it came from Japan because other people have worked on the genetics of it and demonstrated that it came over in ballast water.
Jerry,
Yes.
we have a question in the chat. Somebody is asking, could you give a quick definition of what is a foram?
Yes, I can do that. Let me go back to that there. So foraminifera are single-cell protozoans. They've been around, excuse me, for 545 million years, about 500 million years old. Their first fossils occur at that time. And then they diversified through geologic time, and they track pretty much what we see in animal evolution in terms of diversity increases and extinction events. So, for example, at the Permo-Triassic extinction that's measured by looking at trilobites or other megafauna, the foraminifera die off as well. And the same thing happens at the Cretaceous, about 66 million years ago, when the impact of an asteroid hit the Earth and presumably killed off the dinosaurs. It also killed off all the foraminifera. Not all of them, because they're still here. So it killed off most of the planktonic foraminifera. These occur as plankton or benthic organisms. And the planktonic ones number around 45 species today. And in the Cretaceous, there were about that many as well. That event, extinction event at 66 million years ago, decreased the diversity of planktonic forams from 45 to 3 species. So it was a major event that changed the ecology of the pelagic zone and most of the benthic zones across the world. Now, foraminifera have these shells that you see here, which are mostly made of calcium carbonate, although there are some, like the one down here at the very bottom, that are agglutinated. They pick up particles and build their own shells, and most of them are quite small. About this, they could sit on the head of a pin, and you'd have trouble seeing them. But there are some monstrous ones in the geologic record, and even in the modern, that get to be several inches, and one is even 10 inches in length, made of calcium carbonate in a very complex cigar-shaped form. They've been around, as I said, for a long time, and they have different lengths of time that they have been appearing in the geological record. And so these that we see here in San Francisco Bay are common estuarine foraminifera that we see in estuaries around the world mostly. So they're very useful in determining these things. So because they're so small, a small teaspoon of sediment may contain thousands of these foraminifera. And so they're used in environmental interpretation. And you can do that very quickly if you know your species, and you get a spoonful of sediment, wash it over a screen, look at what the forams are, and you've got enough diversity and enough abundance to make statistical comparisons if you care to. Okay, any other questions about forams? I'll call them forams.
Someone wanted to know if even the biggest ones are single cells.
Yes, they are single celled. They have, some of them have multinuclei, and many of them have symbionts. We'll talk about that later. So let me just go back. This is the Yerba Buena mud. That's the 125,000-year-old mud that was deposited when the bay was full, the time before this modern sediment that's no older than 10 or 13,000 years old. This 125,000. And we see within that there's some distribution differences with the foraminifera. So here's a diagram that just focuses on that Yerba Buena mud, and you can see that there are three associations, and these are controlled by depth and salinity and a few other factors. And so here's the Elphidium hanni, and over here association, the Elphidium excavatum assemblage is here, there, and there, and then the Gunteri is in this area down here. So we know what's going on. These core samples come from Caltrain when they were surveying for a southern bridge to San Francisco, the city of San Francisco. So this is not very far off of Lake Merritt. That's why I show it to you, so that we can see the history that we can't see actually in Lake Merritt, right there in San Francisco Bay. So we had at the bottom the deposition of alluvium, then the bay was formed, 125,000. Then we have sand dunes, more alluvium, and then mud from the present day San Francisco Bay. And this gives you depth from the surface of the present sea level down to 70 meters. Okay, let me move on. And so I want to define for you some of these terms. And none of this would have been around until about 4,000 years ago. So a slough like Elkhorn Slough down near Monterey, these are mudflats, seagrass, marshes, and the distribution of organisms like foraminifera are very patchy. For example, if you get out into one of these marshy areas and take just a random spacing of samples, you'll find anywhere from 1,500 foraminifera to no foraminifera in a few cubic centimeters of sediment in a core. So they're very patchy, but they're common and very abundant when they're there. And here's the best example of an estuary, and that's San Francisco Bay and the other associated bays. So here's the present day coast. The water comes in, mixes with the water that's coming down from the Sacramento River and from the San Joaquin River. They pass through Suisun Bay into San Pablo Bay and then into San Francisco South Bay down here. And the salinities are all around 28 at the surface, and then they decrease as we get closer and closer to the fresh water. These rivers actually started sometime when the Great Valley was filled up with fresh water, and that was due to the entrance to the former seaway that was in this area got closed off by the San Andreas fault motion, and then a lake built up, and then 620,000 years ago, enough water had formed that it eroded its way through into San Francisco Bay, and the exit point at that time seems to have been through Colima down here. And Colima, the exit for the bay, got closed off by the San Andreas Fault, which you see along here from Tomales Bay offshore and then onshore, as this piece of land moved to the northwest. And while this one stayed more or less stationary, but relatively moving towards the south. And then we can see over here the Hayward Fault and a few other faults that we'll show you a bit later. Now, right there, that little dot is Lake Merritt. And so Lake Merritt is an estuary within an estuary. And we'll see that that's not uncommon. So let's see what a lagoon is. The best lagoons that I've experienced are these, formed by coral reefs. And here's on the left, Eniwetok Atoll. It's 80 kilometers around. That's about 60 miles. And to the right is Moorea, about 18 kilometers from Tahiti. And both of these are coral reefs. So Eniwetok is an atoll. The volcano upon which it is built is about 4,000 meters below the surface. You can see at Moorea that the reef actually is a barrier reef growing around the edges of the island. And I want to point out these two bays. This is Cook's Bay, and this is Opunahu Bay, because these are also estuaries. So these are lagoons, and you can see that the definition of a lagoon being water behind a barrier of some sort. And in the case of an atoll, it's completely enclosed. In the case of Moorea, there are breaks in the barrier reef, and those breaks generally correspond to a freshwater source on the island. So there's one here in Cook's Bay, another stream that comes into Opunahu Bay, and then this one over here is due to a stream that comes out there, and similarly over here and back there. Now, these reefs are only 4,000 years old. So these valleys were like Lake Merritt and like other places in the world, graded to the elevation of the sea when it was 400 feet lower than it is now, just 18,000 years ago or so. So this history of sea level change impacts, as I said earlier, the entire world. So Eniwetok is about 11 degrees north of the equator, and Moorea is about 12 or 13 degrees south of the equator, about the same distance. Here's another view of the lagoon, the barrier reef, here at one end of Moorea. And then there's a fringing reef growing along here. And then these are two motus, sandy areas that have been built up by currents washing back and forth, and then they become vegetated. And again, all of these are less than 4,000 years old. Apparently, the sea level at 125,000 years ago is not visible on Tahiti, as far as I could tell, because Tahiti has been subsiding like all these volcanic islands do. They start in a hot spot. The hot spot for this society island change is a little bit west of Tahiti. So this is about 20, 25 kilometers from where there's active eruptions in this hotspot chain of islands. And then to the east of Moorea comes Raiatea, Taha, and Bora Bora, whole line of islands where the barrier reefs end up being pretty much atolls. So let's take a closer look at Cook's Bay here on the left and Apunupo Bay over here. And these are estuaries, as I said. And here's the barrier reef, the pass, and the fringing reef you can see here. And as you go towards the source of the river and the estuary here, the coral reefs stop growing about there and there. And it's much more of a muddy environment. And the foraminifera change. And the same thing we see in Apunuho Valley. The river drains this side of that big picturesque peak, and then we see no coral reefs from where this picture was taken, but there are coral reefs out farther. Now, we studied the foraminifera from Moorea, which is part of French Polynesia, and we published this monograph on all the foraminifera. And this is quite in contrast to what we see in San Francisco Bay, because in San Francisco Bay, we have a dozen or more, a few more species living there. Here, we recorded over 550 species. That's because a reef is a very complex place. And this includes all the reefs. And some of these can grow quite large, like this alveolin and these sorts of things. Here's some other Pardon?
How large are they?
Most of those are about 1 millimeter, quite
Okay.
small.
Mm-hmm.
Here's some from Moorea is sort of out on the eastern extremity of the Indo-Pacific, and the foraminifera are not as diverse and not as large as they are at another place like Madang Lagoon at Papua New Guinea, where we did some work. And here we were able to differentiate within that estuary at Madang. In that lagoon, I mean, there are estuaries that flow in there as well. And some of these, like these star-shaped ones down here, and let me see if I can see a few others. They get pretty big. They're actually large enough to and robust enough to make sandy beaches, and they often are called star sand beaches in various parts of the tropical environment. But we don't see that sort of diversity in our estuaries or even the coastline. Every continent has estuaries except for Antarctica. And here is an example of the intertidal. The only thing growing in this particular picture is some kind of algal or bacterial algal complex of encrusting organisms on a granitic background. And then up in the upper right is a couple of limpets, and these limpets live sometimes in this sort of environment. And when we were scuba diving, I went over to see how these things would react. So I hit the rock with my hammer, and they all ran to a crack. And the reason they do that is because the ice bangs into these environments and keeps them depauperate. And then the other thing that the ice does is this is where an iceberg grounded, and it just tore up the bottom and dug up and exposed these animals. This was about 30 feet in depth. And why is this? Because there are no rivers in Antarctica, because everything everywhere is frozen, as you can see in this picture. So there would be great estuaries there, but they're all frozen. Antarctica was not always frozen. It started getting frozen in the mountains in the Miocene some 13 million years ago, and then became completely frozen. It's about 1.5 times as big as the United States. So I thought I'd throw that in as another example of having no estuaries or lagoons or anything else, with one exception. Here on Livingston Island, you can see it, there are waves out here, and there's ridges in here, and that means that broken pieces of ice, bergy bits and larger icebergs that are floating in the ocean get grounded way out here, and then these become tide pools, and they're loaded with things. Lots of forams, lots of mollusks, lots of things, including fish and penguins swimming in all of these areas here. So this is an interesting contrast, and one that we don't see too often in Antarctica, and it's because of the unique way in which the icebergs are kept out of here by these ridges offshore. So let's take a look at the Eel River up north in Northern California. This is a pretty big river up in Northern California, and this is the mouth of the river, and it's an estuary. And not only is it an estuary, all of these areas in here and formerly around here are grasses, marine grasses. And so we went to this area and a bunch of other places to look at, take cores through it. Here's some of the grass, and here we are taking a 30-foot core through the marsh. And what we did with that is to try to decipher earthquake and tsunami displacements. And we were able to record these 1750 or so tsunami from Japan, which was a major one, the one that they always paint the picture of. We could see that. We could see earthquakes that happened that displaced the elevation of the marsh. Either it went up or it went down, usually down. And when it goes down in areas where there are trees growing, the trees die, and then they're called ghost forests. We haven't seen anything like that at Lake Merritt. So let's look at Lake Merritt for a moment. You guys are all familiar with it. This is a recent Google Earth picture, and I just wanted to point out, here's Echo Glen, Trestle Glen. Here's the exit for what has been called now the Merritt Channel. Used to be the San Antonio Creek. We'll talk about that in a moment. And so we sampled in here for foraminifera through the creek and through all of Lake Merritt. I'll talk about that a bit later. So Lake Merritt's watershed is about 4,650 acres, and it really is Glen Echo and its tributaries entering at Glen Echo branch, and then the tributaries over here, a number of them, teaming up and forming the Trestle Glen arm. And then the other one that's a big contributor is a stream that comes in pretty much down Park Boulevard. And then there are, I wrote 66 drains from nearby roads and areas, and I heard you talking about 62 drains earlier in your discussion. Anyway,
Yes.
over 60
Definitely.
storm drains. And then you can see where the channel enters the, now we call it the Oakland Estuary or Harbor. And that goes now all the way around, and it was dredged around Alameda Island, which was never an island before. So it has had about 10, probably more names throughout history. The Ohlone Hutchin tribes that lived by it 4,000 years ago until 1779, they lived next to it, but I don't know what they called it. It's sort of been lost in history as far as I can tell. And then it was called San Antonio Creek by the Spanish, Mexicans, and Americans from 1772 when the Spanish first saw it to as recently as 2019. And then before the lake formed, it was San Antonio Slough, in other words, mud and grasses. And the Spanish and Mexicans called it San Antonio Slough. Or once the Mexicans in 1821 had given Peralta a land grant. It's Spanish, but it was in 1820. So he had his land grant from 1821 until 1848, and it was called Estero Peralta some of that time. And then when Americans came from 1849 to 1869, they called it Peralta's Lake or Indian Slough, or sometimes the Lake of 1,000 Smells, for two reasons. One is all of that algae, seagrass, and other organisms living in a slough, dying there, low oxygen content produces smells. But it didn't help any that Oakland dumped its sewage into the lake from 1852 until 1890, although they tried to stop it. And then in 1869, Samuel Merritt built a dam that created the lake, and the public called it Merritt's Lake. And for some reason, it became Lake Merritt in 1874, and we still call it that. Some people call it Merritt Estuary, and others call it Merritt Lagoon. But Lake Merritt is a satisfactory name, and it's technically correct, or Merritt Estuary. I don't think Merritt Lagoon is correct, although people call it that, and it certainly sounds like a very pleasant place if you can call it a lagoon. So Lake Merritt lies in a very seismically active part of California. You can see here the faults are named San Gregorio, San Andreas, big earthquake in 1865 and 1906 on the San Andreas, the Hayward fault here, big earthquake there in 1868, and then Lake Merritt is located right about there, and there's Alameda sticking out. So these faults created this San Francisco Bay low-lying area, the faulting and subfolding, so that this was always a low spot between the coast ranges and the hills back here. And this part of the San Andreas system is moving northwesterly as opposed to over here, which is the North American plate, and it's moving relatively southeasterly. And this is the Pacific plate. But it's not just a line like we used to talk about the San Andreas Fault being the boundary. It's a whole assemblage, or the San Andreas system, as I like to think about it. So here's the coastline 13,000 years ago, when sea level was 120 meters, roughly 13,000 years ago. And you can see here that the coastline would have been way out here, about 30 miles offshore. The Farallon Islands would have been hills, and the rivers coming out of San Francisco Bay from the south, with Lake Merritt contributing here, not Lake Merritt itself, but the valley that was created by Lake Merritt. And those rivers joined together to flow all the way across here. So they were eroding with this as their baseline. And so Lake Merritt actually lies in a valley, eroded stream valley, pretty steep one, that starts at about 200 feet over near the hills to 600 feet deep. And it's been called Merritt Canyon by Andrew Alden, a geologist who has written a book about geology of Oakland, which will appear in May, and I recommend that book. So 13,000 or 18,000 years ago, these were the sea level. And then you can see how it creeped up. So here's 14,000 years, here's 11,000 years, 10,000 and 8,000 years ago. It just entered the Golden Gate. And then from 8,000 to 4,000, it rose even more and filled the entire San Francisco Bay and San Pablo Bay. And again, there's Lake Merritt. And that took 13 or 14,000 years from that point. And at the same time, people crossed the Bering Land Bridge and came down the coast, either in boats, down what the archaeologists now call the Kelp Highway, and they then began to populate the coast. So we don't have any record of people down here. They probably arose. We have a date down in San Miguel Island in Southern California of 12.8 thousand years ago. So there were people here around 13,000 years ago. The first time we see people or have a record of them is around 8,000 years. And they are at a different kind of culture than the Ohlone, who appeared for sure around 4,000 in one way or another. So the Golden Gate Bridge, shown here in 1939, this is where the 8,000-year first sea level first penetrated into the Golden Gate through this region. And the Ohlone, who were living there at 4,000 years for sure, began to build shell mounds around San Francisco Bay. They built about 425, actually more than that, because some others have been discovered, and they built them in the area that we're talking about. So there was one at West Berkeley, the big one, which was studied at Emeryville, and then at Lake Merritt, there was one in the channel, next to the channel. There was probably one there, and there were two in Oakland. And this one, I'm a little uncertain about that. It's built in the suburb of Clinton. And at the time that it was subdivided as Clinton Mound subdivision. I don't know what happened to that mound, or maybe it was never there, but anyway, it seems strange to have a place called Clinton Mound without a mound. And then there's one down in, actually 3 or 4, but a big one on Alameda. All of these up here were destroyed before they were ever studied. Emeryville was pretty well studied, as I said, and so was Richmond. The one in Alameda was destroyed before it was studied. So here's West Berkeley Shell Mound back at the turn of the 1900s. And this is Emeryville Shell Mound. And this is one of the excavators. It was started by John C. Merriam, a paleontologist at Berkeley. He got interested in the shell mound and hired Nelson and this guy, Ule, who divided up the task. Nelson counted the shell mounds around San Francisco Bay, and this guy excavated at Emeryville, and they found burials, and I think there were 700 of them, and they found all kinds of tools, and of course the foodstuffs that were remaining, in particular bird bones. Here's the Sather Shell Mound in Alameda in 1908, and it was pretty well destroyed by this group of people. And of course, when the Spanish arrived, the first thing they did was to build a mission, and that's Mission San Jose, the closest one to the East Bay. It's actually in Fremont, and it was built in 1797. Now, the thing that blows me away is that most of this stuff we've been talking about recently here are happening when on the East Coast, we're establishing the United States of America. In fact, it was 1776, well before the Spanish even established this mission. Anyway, they brought the Ohlone people into the mission, essentially enslaved them to labor in the missions. They taught them Spanish, they taught them Christianity, they served as laborers and cowboys to take care of the missions. This map shows, it's a common, you see this commonly when people have a history of Lake Merritt, because it's an 1857 publication of the Coastal Survey that they did a little bit earlier, and it clarifies a few things. So the map shows San Antonio Creek going through this area all the way over here into San Leandro Bay or Cove, And there's the lake channel to Lake Merritt with the two lobes. And you can see what those lobes look like on this thing. So here in Glen Echo, you can see that there was a little tiny sublobe there. That's all been filled in. And this part of Trestle Glen has been filled in, and it's now parkland. And of course, now there's freeways. And in 1857, there were around 1,500 people living in Oakland. And all of this shallow area was mudflat at low tide or grassy, marshy land. So this is now the Oakland Harbor or estuary, and they've dredged channels around Alameda, so it became an island. And this is Samuel Merritt. He was the 13th mayor. He's buried in Mountain View Cemetery after he died in 1890. He was quite creative about things he did. The biggest thing he did was to build a dam at 12th Street here. And what that dam did in 1868, he started this. And in 1869, he finished it. It allowed high tide water to come in, and then it prevented that water from going out and created a lake, since it never had a chance for low tide to drain the lake. And that was supposed to cut down on the smells, and that's why he did that. But it didn't really work too well. This map in 1869 shows the 12th Street Bridge and the dam about 20 feet north of it. And it shows also a bridge, or maybe a potential bridge, and the shape of these arms of the estuary that have been filled in. And the channel was also filled in. It's been re-widened by measure DD. In 1868, there was a big earthquake. We don't know what it did to Lake Merritt, but it certainly destroyed Mission San Jose, the Alameda Courthouse, and a few other things. People in Oakland panicked, and all the horses were running around in the streets. So the story goes. It was about a 6.7 earthquake, they estimate. And we all live with the potential of another big earthquake on that fault. Here's the 1906 earthquake. It caused slumping along the coast, shoreline of Lake Merritt. This is on the west side. And earthquakes, not east quakes, earthquakes occurred in San Francisco. It was the big one for San Francisco, but really the fire caused a displacement of people, many of whom came to Oakland. And here they are, refugees, camped on Adams Point in 1906. And a close-up view of that campsite. So a lot of construction has gone on around the lake. And I just want to point that out. Maybe this, when I finish this, you can say something about your video. So here's a building, an apartment building built in 1909. And then all the streets were reconfigured in 1940. The pergola, was built in 1913, and the big boat landing over at 18th Street was built in 1918. So this is when construction of a lot of things got started, and a lot of it ended, for example, in 1960 with the Kaiser Center, in 2008 with the Cathedral of the Light, Catholic Cathedral, And this is 1200 East Shore apartment building. This building is 28 floors tall. This one is 24 floors tall. There's another building back here, the Kaiser Permanente building, which is similar in height. Now, these things surely change the atmosphere around the lake, not only visually, but in terms of wind flow, wind directions, and so forth. So if you'd like to talk about or show your film, this would be a good place.
Thank you, Jere. Yeah, let's. Can you stay a little bit longer after we do our little video and
Yes,
slide?
I'll finish.
Oh, great. Oh, great.
I have some more to go.
Excellent, excellent. So everyone, we usually start our show with just a couple slides about the highlights of the month for Rotary Nature Center friends. I'd like to show you just a couple of them right now. As we started the show talking about the fish kill and the concern that people have for water quality in Lake Merritt, we have a group of people out there testing the water starting right after the fish kill in August, and recently with continuing into the winter months and the to find out what the dissolved oxygen really is in Lake Merritt, and to kind of get a picture of this. And then the city also has been focusing on what can be done. So we're going to hear from some of the students from the California Climate Action Corps who worked with us in the last few weeks gathering information about water quality in Lake Merritt.
Hi, I'm Leander. I'm a student at CSU East Bay studying geography, and the purpose of this project is to monitor the health of Lake Merritt by looking at measures such as dissolved oxygen, percent oxygen saturation, as well as the temperature of the water at the surface and at depth. To do that, we use some tools like the sucky disc and a sonding device to measure the turbidity in the water at different depths, as well as take a lot of measurements.
Hi, I'm Sydney from the California Climate Action Corps, and along with measuring the health of the lake, we took plankton samples to see the health of the plankton and the health of the animals in the plankton, or in the lake, sorry. And another just interesting thing is that a lot of the plankton was too small, so it went right through our, what's it called? Right through our net.
5 micrometer net.
Yeah, 20 micrometer net. Yeah, thank you.
Very cool.
What I found interesting today is how low the oxygen levels went in the water when we got over by the bird sanctuary. Also, the water was very, very bronzy and brown. And finally, what was really interesting to me is over all the way by the staircase, there was like a blanket or like a cloud of algae like coming towards us. Like we went over, I thought it was cement that we were going over, but it was like we entered this algae pocket.
Cute.
Hi, I'm Leander. I'm a student at CSU East Bay studying geography, and what I thought was really fulfilling was actually working with the tools, the sonde, to measure the different levels of dissolved oxygen at depth, as well as the percent oxygen saturation. And it was really cool, like seeing how high it was at the surface by the bird sanctuary versus how much lower it was like in the center of the lake where the water was a lot deeper.
People are disproportionately affected by climate change, and we're trying to improve the lake so people can have access and hopefully swim in it one day. You go first.
All right, so the connection to climate that I was specifically interested in is as we see warming ocean temperatures, the waters that come in the bay through the estuary will be warmer, which makes it easier for algae to grow. And with the rising lake levels, we're going to see some shallower waters, especially along the periphery of the lake, like here by the boathouse and in the bird sanctuary, where there's another larger ecosystem for algae to grow. So this research is important because the algae bloom that happened in 2022 was massive, and it's not going to be the last one.
Thank you, Climate Action Fellows. We have one last thing to share. We wanted to, as a highlight, I think has been our effort with Rotary Nature Center Friends to get community people involved in studying Lake Merritt and studying the ecology and so we got things in the wage and awesome. Okay, so one of the highlights of the month for us was to bring together different groups who are working here at Lake Merritt to do some water testing and to take care of the lake. So we've had people from the Lake Merritt Institute, from the Achieve group of high school students that service every weekend, and from the California Climate Action Corps. And we had in the course of our work, we do water testing. We also look at the plankton, takes plankton samples every week. We witnessed a winter bloom of Euglena-like plankton. And it was short-lived, but interesting to see the activity of the microbes in Lake Merritt. Let's see the next slide quickly, if we can. Yes. So we want to encourage everyone to learn more about Lake Merritt and the situation that we're facing regarding potential additional algae blooms. The Lake Merritt Institute is leading the charge here with a plan to install buoys that will monitor the water quality, including the nutrients, the algal pigments, and the salinity and the dissolved oxygen. And these will be coming online soon. They're also interested in taking care of the using technology to support low oxygen when it occurs, to avoid potentially or hopefully the kind of massive kill that we saw in August. Let's see what comes next. Slide, the last one. Yeah, so this is our Euglena find that we had. It was quite striking, green color to the lake, and then when we looked under the water in the microscope, we saw these little Euglena cells. This was right after the big atmospheric river rain event. The water at the surface of Lake Merritt was almost fresh, almost drinkable, and the water at depth was still pretty salty. So there was a stratification occurring, and different organisms bloomed in that period of time. Now things have returned to more of a normal brackish condition, but we'll see what happens as we go forward. And I think that is the last slide. So thank you all for listening to our efforts here, and I hope you'll support Lake Merritt Institute and Rotary Nature Center Friends in our efforts to learn more about the lake and its biology. Let's turn it back over to Dr. Lipps again, and thank you so much for allowing the break.
So the question that we all have is, what lives in Lake Merritt? There are about, in my estimate, about 600 species that we can see. 60 of those species are invasives that have come from some other part of the world. But this diagram that I'm showing you here, simplified, it's a phylogenetic diagram of all the eukaryotes. That's everything except bacteria, archaea, and viruses, which also occur in Lake Merritt. What we see in Lake Merritt are animals and plants, land plants, and green algae. And all these other things are single-celled organisms like foraminifera, diatoms, dinoflagellates, ciliates, tintenids in particular, that are marine, red algae. They're all of these are single-celled, and only this group really, these are all parasitic. All of these other ones can be expected in Lake Merritt. In addition, bacteria are really an important part of any marine ecosystem. They build mats on the bottom of the ocean. I've never scuba dived in a warm ocean and not found a mat on the bottom of bacteria, and sometimes including diatoms. So we should expect to see maybe a couple thousand species in Lake Merritt once it's completely studied. It doesn't want to advance for some reason. There we go. So the invasive species actually have a historical component. This one, for example, Maya was introduced to San Francisco Bay in about 1870 by railroad carloads of oysters filled up in New England and then traveled across the United States and got dumped into San Francisco Bay. And from the bay, of course, they moved into Lake Merritt, and these shells are very common on the intertidal. This one and that one are another invasive species that came in about 1980, let's say. This is a Japanese clam. And I already told you about the Japanese foram that came in. So here are foraminifera. These are what we were studying, forams and ostracods. Ostracods are crustaceans, metazoan. They're about the same size or a little bit bigger than foraminifera. All these forams came out of Lake Merritt, and I want to point out this one, that one, that one, that one, and that one are all deformed forams. And forams tend to deform and grow crooked shells like this one and this one. And this one's got their chambers all screwed up. Here's one that doesn't quite have it when it's small, but it gets bigger. Always in polluted areas. This is a sign of pollution. In other words, they're not living their lives very well. And here's the forams from Lake Merritt. This is a duplicate of the previous foram slide, and here's a bunch of other ones. And all of these are identified. And let me show you in the left-hand diagram are our collecting localities in 2002 and 3. And this shows the percentage of foraminifera that are alive in our samples. So you can see that in the channel, there's about 25 to 50% are alive. Once you get into the lake, there's about less than 25%, except for one area which is covered up there. This is a blow up of just the lake, so that there's abundant forams around the edges, and really abundant there, that's 50% in the start of Glen Echo arm, and then down here. And you'll notice in the center of the lake, there are hardly any foraminifera. And why is that? Well, it goes along with what happened with the anoxic events that were recorded in August. Not only did fish die, so did invertebrates. So here's the temperature, salinity, and dissolved oxygen. You can see at the surface, salinity is low, 9 or 10 parts per thousand, and then it increases. And the reason for that is because it's an estuary, seawater coming in from the ocean or the bay in this case is more dense than fresh water. So the fresh water floats on top of the salt water. And we discovered this in the Russian River, for example. About a mile and a half up the river, I dove into a little pocket and it was all salty water. Even though they have floods there of 30 or 40 feet that wipes the whole estuary clean, the salinity remains low because of the salt water, which is hard to remove. And then all of that ties into the dissolved oxygen. So we start with milligrams per liter here, 14 or 12. And then as you go down, when you hit that salinity gradient, you begin to get less and less oxygen. And you can see then that the low oxygen contents of the outer part of the lake is of the inner part of the lake is what's restricting the foraminifera. They do not like to be in low oxygen environments. So all you have to do is shift this curve over and you have a complete decimation of the entire fauna like we had in August. So for August, this curve, I think you have the data on this, Katie, was pretty much the same or very similar. So that's the main.
In August, it was the oxygen was zero, top to bottom.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
But not so deep. Lake Merritt's not so deep, so.
No, these are our measurements are from different samples.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what we found.
So yeah, the lake this is fairly normal for the lake with low oxygen at the base because of the salt water that puts a cap on it. And then when it shifts over, as it did for some reason in August, probably the bloom in that alga, and it becomes anoxic throughout the water column is when everything dies. Not surprising. So here are, again, our sampling sites. There were 35 of them, 36 actually. One of them's off the right there, all the way through the entire lake. And this is in progress of being published. So one of the questions is how to deal with that lack of oxygen in the bottom. And we have these fountains, which are mostly decorative. What they do, we learned from Alex last month, is that these water droplets that are picked up near the bottom and then sprayed out, they don't really spend much time in the air to absorb oxygen. So mostly this just mixes bottom water with top water, which is helpful. But you would need hundreds of these because this only has an effective radius of about 100 feet around this fountain. So you'd have to have hundreds of them in Lake Merritt if you use this. There are other techniques, of course. And then lastly, this is an old picture of Adams Point and Glen Echo and over there, Trestle Glen. At 125,000 years ago, sea level was up above here. And all this flat area over there and on Adams Point and over here in Oakland were under the ocean by a good 20 feet. And it might happen again. The city of Oakland predicts or is planning for a 4-foot rise in sea level, and that would include Lake Merritt, by 2050 and 9 feet by 2100. The 4-foot rise in sea level would push Lake Merritt over onto the roads and parklands. The 9-foot would mean that Lake Merritt would entirely be underwater by 5 feet. Now, those measurements, or those estimates, I should say, are based on the thermal expansion of seawater mostly. They do not consider glacial input to the oceans from Greenland or Antarctica, where glaciers that run into the sea are becoming unstable because the ocean at depth where the glaciers are grounded are not only expanding and lifting the glaciers, they are melting the glaciers because the water's warmer. And once they lose their foothold, those glaciers, some of which are as big as Florida, will flow into the ocean and raise sea level. We'll have a whole bunch of little tsunamis, I guess, over the period it takes for the glacier to get completely exhausted, that will come in but not go out. That could raise sea level back to where it was 125,000 years ago, and we would lose not only Lake Merritt, but almost all of the coastline of the East Bay and everywhere else in the world. So sea level rise is an important issue. It gets distorted sometimes. Most recently, I heard former President Trump say that there would be only 1/8 of an inch sea level rise in the next 300 years. I don't know where he got that, but we've already experienced about 10 inches in the last century or so. So thanks very much. Always fun to talk about Lake Merritt.
Jere, thanks so much. There's some good questions in the chat. Do you have a couple moments to take a question?
Sure.
Or two? Okay. So let's see. Had a couple of them. So we had one question was why we're going way back. Someone was looking at one of your photos of the cross sections of the bottom of the bay, the Lake Merritt and the bay going out
Yes.
into the ocean, and noticed that the foraminifera seems to be kind of in the top layers. Is that a reason for that?
Was that question referring to the cross sections of the bay?
Well, yeah.
Well, those cross sections are as if you cut the bay down and then looked at it. So
Okay. I think I'm using the wrong word.
I did not have, I only focused on the forams in the 125,000 year period, the Yerba Buena mud, but the same fauna occurs in the modern.
Okay, so her question was, why are forams superior than other neofauna in this? I thought she meant up higher up in the on the floor, but
you mean she's saying why are they better?
I don't know, maybe better or more persistent or more numerous.
Well, I think I said they were better because you can sample them so much easier. And I can go out into Lake Merritt and collect 10,000 specimens of forams in 30 species or so in the same time it would take you 2 weeks to collect mollusks.
Yeah.
It's just that there's so many of them. They're so small, so abundant, usually.
And are there, and you showed that there are different species had different, were likely to be found in different types of habitats, and that can give you information when you're.
Yes. Yeah. There were 3 different associations, and we characterized them by the dominant ones, but other ones in the assembly. It wasn't just that as a single species. They were mixtures of all the same species, but with different proportions. So we can tell by the proportion about their habitats. For example, there are some forams that live in the edges of salt marshes, way, way up where it's even dry. As long as they get wet once or twice a month, they're happy there. But most of them live down where it's damp or where they get inundated. But we can tell because these are associations change, even if all the species are still present. It's the proportion of the species that are relevant to those associations, if that's clear.
I think so, yeah. So if you have a question, if you'd like to raise your hand, that would be a good, we can give you a chance to unmute and ask your question.
Okay, let me stop the share.
Okay.
So this is the sea monster.
Oh, yeah.
Anybody know what it is? It looks like a ray, a shark, and maybe an ichthyosaur tail. I don't know.
It has a cool tail. It's
over in Snow Park.
Yeah, I think I thought it, yeah, so Leander thinks it's a bat ray. And
yeah, it looks, well, this part looks like a bat ray. This part looks like a shark. The head, I don't know what the head is. And the tail part, which I can't see on my screen very well, has the fin part on the bottom. And there's a few ichthyosaurs that have that too. Anyway.
And Mitch is saying it represents a mythical creature from the Ohlone, and there is a name for it.
Yes.
And I don't have it on the tip of my tongue. Yeah, it starts with an M.
Yeah.
If anyone knows it, please put it in chat. We have one of our participants said if they have a question, how could they contact you?
There's my email address. You're welcome to send me an email if you want.
Thank you. Okay, and so really amazing. To see those the beautiful shells of or they're not shells, but what is the name of the shell of the foram?
Well, we call them tests in the same way that you would call a sea urchin shell a test. And the reason for that is that there's protoplasm on the outside.
Interesting. So,
but
yeah,
they have a peculiar kind of pseudopodium that only foraminifera possess. It's called a granuloreticulopod. So it's more like a spider web with granules going out. And the pseudopodia can extend 3 or 4 or 5 times the length or the diameter of the shell.
Yeah, that's amazing. So William Wood has a question about salmon and steelhead and salmon in Lake Merritt. Are they natives? And I think
Vanada has a question.
Pardon?
Vanada has had her hand up and she had a question too.
Well, let's go to Vandana then. Okay. Vandana, go ahead, ask your question, please.
Yeah, good morning from India. Am I audible to all?
Yes.
Yeah. So good morning all. I am a fresh PhD, currently submitted my thesis on foraminifera from estuarine environment. I worked on Indian Sundarban, so I could relate very much to the presentation what was seen by Jere sir. So I have few questions. Whenever I was doing my PhD, that time also some questions were popping up in my mind, and I was going through many of the articles and in Google, but none could have satisfied me. So like regarding the patchiness of foraminifera, since I worked in the estuarine sediment, intertidal and subtidal, both the ecosystem showed a different type of patchiness behavior. So I want to know about this patchiness. Is it throughout the column of the sediment we do get the patchiness of benthic foraminifera, or it's on the surface of the sediment, few meters apart, we get this patchiness? So what is the trend of this benthic foraminifera of estuarine environment?
Well, in the environments that have been sampled, which are like a grassy marsh, that's where we did the work at Bodega Bay, which is another estuary. The patchiness was in the top centimeter. We took a core that was just the top centimeter, and how that extends down below is it's difficult because there's a lot of taphonomic problems with the shells. They get recirculated down by bioturbation with worms and crabs and shrimp to depths of 3 or 4 feet, a meter for you. They dissolve. Any shell in a marsh, unless it's protected by a membrane that it secretes, like in Cerithidium, will dissolve in the acids of the marsh. And what the marsh does to the forams is to degrade the organic cement so that the shells fall apart or become more fragile. So I don't know about the preservation of marsh foraminifera through time from the sampling we did. That's just at the surface, looking at their community and association structures. Other people have looked at bedding planes in the fossil record, like in Miocene, and they see a patchiness there too. But those are deep water deposits.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yes, nice to see you.
Thank you.
Questions. It's wonderful to have people from India tuning in on our program. It's really thank you for your questions and telling us about your research a bit. We have other people with hands up. There was someone who had a hand up and had a question about the salmon. And would you like to say something about that, Jere, about whether they're native or not?
Well, the salmon are about 200 times larger than foraminifera, so I don't get to look at them too often. I eat them sometimes. But I believe that this, we heard a talk about the salmon not long ago in this session. Do you remember what he said about salmon?
Well, that he said that that they're they come and go into the as the sea level rises and as the topography changes on the coast, that they come in, that then they get cut off and will evolve in different directions into different strains and so forth. I'm familiar with a study by Dr. Leidy of the salmonids in the Bay Area in Northern California, and he hypothesized, or he thought that there was some evidence that there may have been salmon in Glen Echo historically, but and then I know that steelhead are can have multiple cycles of coming in and spawning and then going back to sea and then coming back out. And it seems possible, but I don't know if there's any evidence that they were in Lake Merritt. I was wondering about evidence in the shell mounds for different in the I guess most of them were right on the bay, so that might not tell you much, but maybe more inland if there were they had a use of salmon from the Lake Merritt and Oakland areas.
Well, we do know from the bones in the shell mounds what was there. I think salmon was included, but I don't remember for sure. And one of the things that somebody recently saw was looking at bird bones through time in the midden and how they became smaller and less abundant. And they interpret that as human predation on the birds. We see that in other middens. For example, they may have big haliotis at the bottom of the midden and then small ones at the top. So predation by people, including us, is a problem. I think since they opened up the channel down to the Oakland estuary and made it much wider, the lake is becoming more marine. And that means that we're going to have more and more marine animals, big ones, coming in. And they already catch halibut and rays and sharks and what else did these guys tell me? Oh, halibut and salmon too, down in the channel. I was talking to some fishermen.
Yeah, we've seen them come in through they can come in through the tide gates and the gratings, and of course striped bass are very numerous in the lake. There were a lot of bat rays in the fish kill, whether they were once resident bat rays or whether they swam into the channel. I don't know if anyone could determine or did, but there's certainly a lot of big fish can get into Lake Merritt and out. So likely. In terms of there's been a long-term increased saltiness of the bay, hasn't there been? And not only, and certainly we've had periods of long periods of drought, which have caused salinity in Lake Merritt to be very high for long periods of time. So I think we're likely to see more marine fauna establish itself and stay going in Lake Merritt. And we have more questions? Well, this has been a wonderful program. I'm looking for hands. I want to thank everyone for coming, and I hope that your interest here in the lake and in the biology of an estuary and sea system will continue, and consider supporting efforts to keep the lake water quality sufficient to sustain the wildlife that we all love to see at the lake. I'd like to mention, I'd like to thank all of our people who came tonight. Also, our programs are rebroadcast on the City of Oakland's television station, KTOP TV, and you can tune in there and see this program and other programs that we've had over the last 2 years, all connected in some way to our jewel of Oakland, right in the middle of the city. And so I want to thank you all so much. And if you have questions that didn't get answered, you can of course send them to Jere directly. If you want to send some to me, I'll try to assemble some lists of links and so forth to send out in our post chat. Our next chat is going to be, in fact, a talk by Andrew Alden from the Oakland Geology blog, and he's going to talk about the rocks of Oakland, and you'll receive the link for that talk as well. That will be on March 3rd. So Jere, any last words?
Well, I just want to thank everybody again. It was great to see so many people tonight. Once again, this is a great series. And Lake Merritt's a great place.
It truly is, and it just was so amazing to get that depth of deep time view of the lake and how it's changed, and debunk some of the theories that it is a lagoon and that it is 10,000 years old. So anyway, thank you very much. I enjoyed you and having everybody here tonight. And please come back in March. And again, thank you so much. Well, any last comments? If not, let's all clap. And thank you, Jere, so much. It was really fun.
You're welcome.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Good night.
Night.